just to get us going, could you just tell us a little bit about how you came to chair the Pensions Commission? What was the process by which you were approached and appointed?
I think the Pension Commission came into being, if I remember rightly, in 2003. And I can't remember where the initial phone call came from, but I think it was a combination of Number 10 and the DWP, which was then run by Andrew Smith. I remember having a meeting with Andrew Smith to talk about the details of it, but I think it was always clear that this was something that the Prime Minister wanted to happen, and that therefore there was a major role of the Number 10 in defining what they wanted to do, though I know that behind the scenes there'd been a very careful debate and negotiation with Treasury as to the breadth of our terms of reference.
So your terms of reference included a rather sort of gnomic reference to the potential for looking into the state system and not just to the private system. And that, of course, is what, as a commission, you then did.
Our terms of reference, broadly speaking, and I think this reflected the Treasury, restricted us to the private sector savings, with, I think, a small reference that if it was relevant, we might have to make some comments on the state pension. But we decided within about 6 months that it was, frankly, impossible to comment on the incentives for private savings without thinking about the impact of means testing. The only way to get rid of means testing was to make the standard state pension more generous by linking it to average earnings, not prices. And the only way to make that affordable to the Treasury was to increase the state pension age in a deal which was a more generous pension at a later age. I mean, to be blunt, I will be absolutely blunt in retrospect, I proposed to Jeannie and John that we should go beyond our terms of reference and do what we needed to do. And that was a somewhat conscious decision that we were going to do that. And I think sometimes in order to get things done in public policy, you have to do that.
And so you were also heading up a commission of 3 people. You mentioned
Yep.
John Hills and Ginny Drake there. It wasn't a royal commission. Was it the fact that it was the 3 of you that made a big difference to how you were able to work?
Actually, I think that's very interesting, that because there were just 3 of us, we weren't a great big wide commission, we were able to forge a sort of very unified point of view of what we had to say. And the way we proceeded, I remember just in the process, is we would have these, meetings of the 3 of us with the Secretariat, with a lot of analysis, what was going on in demography, what was going on savings, etc., all-day meetings with, hundreds of slides of facts. But every 4 months, John and Jeannie and I would have a dinner on a rotation round our different houses, one or other of us providing dinner. And at those, we would sit back and say, what do we really believe here? And I remember it was one of those about 6 months into the project where I had come along with a proposition, which was just, I think, a single piece of paper with some sort of heads for debate set out. And I remember John saying at the end of it, when I went through that over a glass of wine at the beginning of dinner, he said, well, that's gone a little bit beyond our terms of reference, but I think we have to. So I have to say it was a conscious decision.
And so marshalling that evidence base is a very important part of the account here, isn't it? How did you go about making sure that you had this really robust evidence base?
We deliberately decided to give ourselves a year up to November 2004 to simply set out what were the facts and therefore a point of view of what was going to happen if policy didn't change. And that was the first report that we issued in October or November 2004. And then to move on to, well, what is the solution to that? And that was a very conscious decision that we had to have that fact basis. And it's 150 pages of analysis with actually, I think, 5 or 6 appendices on different aspects of it. We had a very good team of civil servants at DWP. I think there were about 10 or 12 in total, I mean, relatively small, but high quality. And what we were doing was going systematically through, first of all, let's get the demographics right. What's going to happen to the number of people aged 20 to 65 versus the number over it, etc. Why is that going to occur? That was one important block. There was another important block, which was what was happening to the level of private savings. And here we discovered a quite major error in a crucial line in the Blue Book. And as you all know, the Blue Book, National Income and Accounts, is one of the most central accounts that National Income and Statistics produce. And in there, the amount of private savings was clearly wrong. Now, interestingly, David Willetts had sort of rumbled that there was something wrong with it and had asked some parliamentary questions. And I'm afraid to say, and this is an interesting bit of how the civil service has to be careful of its dual role as a impartial advisor to government and a defender of ministers against parliamentary questions. The DW machine roared into action to provide a set of answers to David, which basically said it's all okay, the figures are right. David didn't have an access to the detail to prove that they were wrong. And what DWP ought to have said at that stage is, well, this parliamentary question actually, prima facie, does raise some questions about whether the figures are right. So we had to dive into unbelievable detail. I mean, I remember sitting with Office of National Statistics, going down to, their detailed work, and we discovered the coding errors. But this was order of magnitude, a figure which should have been 15 billion was in there as 25 billion. It was a very major mistake. So across all the areas of how much are people saving, how many people are in pension schemes, what is the trend of the defined benefit schemes, how rapidly are they declining, but also what are the costs of administration of pension schemes. When somebody saves in a defined benefit scheme a certain amount, how much are they getting in gross return, but how much of that is disappearing in administrative returns. We set all that out in chapters with, I guess, a couple of hundred exhibits, deliberately trying to get this agreement. And then what we did was, on the basis of that report, we then held a set of very consultative stakeholder engagements. I remember we had meetings. I remember they were at the Excel building down near London Airport with about 80 relevant stakeholders from the relevant charities, the TUC, the CBI, the Institute of Actuaries, all the government parties, where John and Jeannie and I presented it and said, look, we think that given the facts, this is what is going to occur. But also at that stage, we said, and given these facts and what is going to occur, we think the logically exclusive set of possible answers is this. Either you do this, or you do this, or you do this, or you do this. Before we debate which of these should you do, can we all agree that there is nothing else out there, that you're going to have to do this, and you're going to have to make these trade-offs? We also, I remember, and I can't remember when it is, we had a really big national conversation event where we got about 1,000 people around the country, sort of invited citizens, in 4 different locations linked by video conference. And I remember we began with asking them what they thought about raising the state pension age, about paying more taxation, about the pensions getting less generous. And then we gave a presentation that says, here are the mathematical facts. Given these mathematical facts, either you have to retire later, or you have to pay bigger contributions or make more savings in working life, or you will be poorer in retirement. Now, given that we are saying that that is an inevitable mathematical trade-off, what do you now prefer? And it was, I think it was one of the biggest exercises that there's been in that sort of, national conversation, and it was very effective. I mean, we had presentations, then we had discussions at tables, and John and Jeannie and I walked around the tables and listened to what people were saying. Then we replayed what we were getting out of that, and then we took votes on the options at the end of the day compared with the beginning of the day, and we found that people were much more willing to accept that there were inevitable trade-offs. So it was a very fact-based approach, and also a very, very stakeholder engagement approach, which is why it took 2 years for us to produce a final report.
So did you feel then that first report did give you the grounds to then build this consensus that in the second report you were able to?
Yeah.
And could you say a little bit then about how you went about trying to ensure that the industry, the big players, TUC and others, started to buy into this consensus?
Well, the consensus, I think, even before the November 2004 first report, we had been talking to all the relevant groups, the CBI, the TUC, Help the Aged, the different parties, about what was emerging in our analysis. And we, I was invited to give speeches. There were lots of, each of those institutions would invite either John or Jeannie along and talk about what we were doing, and we'd expose some of our data. But really, we went into sort of really intensive stakeholder engagement once we had the November 2004 first report out there. And we then went into an intensive process of both joint stakeholder meetings with everybody in the room together for 3 or 4 hour sessions, presentations, are these the facts, what does everybody think, etc., and what are the options to produce the solution. But also at that stage, just continual meetings with the different relevant stakeholders. I remember talking with Steve Webb at the Liberal Democrats, for a time actually, it was Malcolm Rifkind after the 2005, because remember there was also the 2005 election comes in the middle of this. And by the way, that was almost deliberate, not to try to produce a recommendation on what we should do in the run-up to the election, because we thought if you produce something, a recommendation on what you should do in the run-up to the election, and the government says we're going to do that, the opposition says we're not going to do that. So we had deliberately designed it so that the recommendations on what you should do would fall after the 2005 election, but right at the beginning of a parliament, which is the time at which you are most likely to create a political consensus around a long-term vision. So it was this combination of joint meetings with stakeholders, this big national conversation debate we had, but also just lots and lots of individual meetings. And then in the course of 2005, up until November the 30th, 2005, when we launched the report, we were taking that analytical fact base and then coming up with the bits of what we thought the answer was. And we were exploring that with different groups at that time, though I don't think anybody knew until November the 30th how we had proposed to put together the jigsaw puzzle. Though we had talked enough to all of the major parties that, broadly speaking, we launched that at 11 o'clock in the morning on November the 30th, 2005, and by the evening news, all of the political parties had supported it, including all supporting an increase in the state pension age, which none of them had previously proposed. And indeed, I do remember, I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was one politician where I said, we think we will have to increase the state pension age. And they said, well, if you say it, we will support it, but we can't say that first. So it was rather like sort of, there's machine guns out there, you get out of the trench first. But that was part of our role.
And the important thing that you said there about a jigsaw puzzle was that you put together these different elements in your recommendations. The argument being that you can achieve a consensus because everybody has to give something and everybody can take something. Is that right?
I mean, because we had a fact-based and we'd got this consensus as everybody agreed that if we don't change, something's going to go wrong. I mean, so the aspects of if we don't change and if we continue to link the state pension to prices rather than earnings permanently, more and more people are going to be subject to means testing. Because that's just going to happen if your definition of poverty is at all linked with average earnings, not prices. If we don't change and we just leave this savings to a voluntary basis, and with the runoff of the big corporate DB schemes, more and more people are going to be entirely dependent on the state because people just don't voluntarily make a decision to join a pension scheme on an entirely voluntary atomistic basis. They tend to join pension schemes if the state tells them to or the employer tells them to or something like that. And we ran some figures that said, if we leave this is what's going to happen to how many people have adequate pensions in retirement. And then we put together the jigsaw puzzle, which was we need to put a stop to the growth of means testing, because if more and more people are subject to means testing, a lot of financial advisors won't want to advise them to invest in a private pension because they'll be worried that part of that money is going to disappear in means testing and that in 20 years' time they might be accused of mis-selling. So we had financial advisors saying, just don't touch the bottom half of the population. So we had to shift the means testing thing to make the incentives for lower income people good to do private savings. We felt that we also had to fix the issue of how do you reduce costs for people of low and low income working in small companies. I mean, the big fact is that the typical person deciding to go into a personal pension sold to them on an individual basis by a pension company, insurance company salesperson, was paying in administrative charges 150 to 200 basis points, and the member of the Unilever pension fund was effectively paying about 12 to 15 basis points. And so we had a whole bit, which is how do you deliver to the lower income person much lower, and the person working in a small company, which doesn't have economies of scale, much, much lower administrative charges. And out of that came the idea of Nest as a bulk buyer. So there was limit means testing, reduce administrative charges, and then there was the crucial decision on where we were going to be on voluntary versus compulsory. We had become convinced that even if you got rid of means testing and had better incentives, pure voluntary wasn't going to work. We observed that around the world, there is no place where if you leave private pension saving to pure voluntary, you get a high level of involvement. And so we had been looking at this American emerging economic theory of nudge behavioral economics. Richard Thaler, from Chicago, won the Nobel Prize for it. We had observed the role of auto-enrollment in some US 401k schemes, and we said, why don't we apply that? This was a bit which has bluntly succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. I mean, we ran figures that said if we switch to an auto-enrolled basis where you have to opt out versus opt in, maybe we'll take participation rates from 40 to 70%, and they've ended up at 90%. So we had that, and then the final bit we had, well, if we get rid of means testing by linking the state pension to average earnings, not prices, that is going to get more and more expensive for Treasury if you leave the state pension age at 65. And logically, you should move the state pension age at 65 as a sort of above 65 as a sort of fair intergenerational balance so that each cohort has roughly the same proportions of life spent working and in retirement. I think that's a reasonable intergenerational contract. So these four blocks of the argument fitted together. And then different people had to accept it. So the insurance companies had to accept that we were fundamentally saying we're going to set up a state sponsored body, which will take a large market share of where the insurance companies might wanted to have sold products. True to say, however, that most of the insurance companies had by then decided that selling product in pensions, individual pensions on an individual basis to people below average earnings in SMEs was almost impossible to make money out of in any case. So there wasn't all that much resistance from them for the creation of Nest. The CBI, crucially, had to accept the employer's matching contribution, because it wasn't just the auto-enrollment system, it was the fact that we were going to auto-enroll something into something where you put in 5%, but 1% of that was really paid by the taxpayer from tax deductibility, and 3% was paid by the employer contribution. And, you know, the CBI, was happy with that, actually. And we also talked, obviously, with the other employer groups, etc. And that wasn't too difficult, because although there was a sort of, well, how fast is this going to happen? You know, is it going to be 3 or 5%? There was an acceptance, I think, of industry that they were going to have to play their part, and that if you didn't do this, it wasn't going to work, and we were going to have, you know, something more radical would have to be proposed at a later stage. So you're quite right that what we were trying to do in the sort of stakeholder engagement was to build consensus for this overall package, paying attention in particular to the bits of the package that might be most difficult for some constituencies to accept. And I remember actually at the point where we had decided that we had got to advise that as part of the package the state pension age was going up, Jeannie saying, well, I better go off and tell Brendan Barber, General Secretary of the TUC, that. And she said, I think I'll take a stiff drink in advance before I break the news to him that, you know, I'm signing off on this report. So, you know, there had to be give all the way across different people's opening points of view.
Are you then at a point where you're able to say, well, there can be no changes to this? Because often what happens, of course, when you get finally to the end of the process, the politics come in. Is it because you're comfortable that all does hang together that you're able to say, no, we're not going to change any of this? Yeah,
that's right. We were clear that we were not going to change it. We obviously had intense meetings with Gordon in advance, in which I have to tell you he attempted to get me to change what was in it. There were various features he didn't like, and we had a, let's say, robust exchange of views. But we said, this is the package, and this is the package. I think in retrospect, insofar as there was watering down, it was really all about timing, right? So a set of decisions were made to make the introduction staggered over a long period of time. So we are now, the whole thing is now in place with the 5% employee contribution and the 3% employer contribution, and applying to every company, however small. But we only actually got there last year, having recommended it in 2006. And I think we regretted that we didn't have a transmission process that, a transition that lasted, say, 5 years rather than effectively 12 years. Now, partly, of course, what happened was the financial crisis 2008, and then the Treasury and government being worried about, do we want to impose extra cost on business at just this point in the cycle, etc. So that's where there was, as it were, a watering down. I think we had hoped that there was we recognised there would be a transition path, but we thought it might take 5 years, and it took longer. I think, however, what is interesting is that although it's taken longer to get there, all the bits of the jigsaw puzzle have survived. We have a link to average earnings, and also actually we have what we had skirted around, and I think we would probably have recommended if we had been given a clearer state pension mandate, which was the consolidation of state second pension and the basic state pension into the single, easily understandable, everybody gets, order of magnitude, what is it now, £160 a week, 8,000 quid a year. You've got that, that's certain, that's not means tested. I think we've ended up in an even better place than we had recommended there, and actually Steve Webb played a major role in that when he was in the coalition government. So that is there even better than we thought. The increase in the state pension age, I think, is largely accepted. People can argue about the pace, but the principle is largely accepted. Nest is there as an available bulk buyer, and the auto-enrolment is there as well. So the fundamental architecture has survived, because I think once all the parties had come out and all the relevant bodies had come out, in sort of December 2005 and early 2006 and said, yes, we support it, that was the basis where the compromises and the gives were really about the details and the transition, but not about the broad aspects of the architecture.
That having all been said, let's just take a couple of criticisms. One criticism is that perhaps defined benefit schemes weren't, dying in quite the way that everybody said in that period in the late 90s, early 2000s, that more could perhaps have been done to rescue DB schemes.
Yeah.
What would be your response to that?
Yeah, look, I think the decline of the DB schemes is unfortunate, and we did put something in there. We didn't quite know how to, it's not easy to pass a set of rules that have rescued the DB schemes. What should have happened is greater flexibility and imagination in the reform of the DB schemes. The way we thought it, DB schemes went through a cycle of being introduced with certain features back in the 1950s, having added to them a whole load of other features which were legislated in, which made them gold standards, but with the loop in the legislation which said if you've got a DB scheme, it's got to be this absolute gold standard, but you don't have to have a DB scheme at all. So back when they emerged in the 1950s and 60s, they didn't have to be indexed to prices. They didn't have to give full spouses benefits. There were a whole series of other features which were there. And slowly over time, they added and added. What they also, of course, occurred is they wrote into them the pension age is 65, and they wrote that when the average expectation of life at 65 was 12 years, and by 2004 it was 23 years, but they were still in there. So my ideal would have been a set of corporates looking at those DB schemes and going to trade unions and saying, look, this is unaffordable, but here's something that could be affordable. Not final salary, but average salary. Not absolutely agreed indexation, but something like the Netherlands system, whereby there's a base load of guaranteed indexation, and the bit above that will depend on performance, on investment performance. And with retirement ages not absolutely fixed in advance at 65, because when you hire somebody age 20, you have no idea what life expectancy will be when they get to 65, but formulas that say you are entering a scheme where the current retirement age is 65. When you get to your late 60s, your retirement age in this scheme will be 65 plus 2/3 of the increase in life expectancy, which has occurred between now and when you get to your late 60s. Those would have been very, very good contracts to have. They would have been sustainable contracts because they would have been based upon a manageable risk sharing between the company and its employees. But I'm afraid the dynamics just didn't push it in that direction, because what the trade unions tended to say was, you must not touch the scheme as it exists, but we're not going to stop you closing the scheme to new members. Now, maybe with more imagination on the size of corporates, to go to trade unions with a wider set of options, it would have worked. So you may be right, that could be a criticism. It's quite difficult to know what the public policy tool that does, so we did have a section that said, here is a vision, of a more risk-sharing form of DB that might be sustainable, we'd encouraged companies to look at it, but we didn't quite know how to make it happen. But I think we'd sort of ended up in the 1990s where we'd almost legislated a situation that says, if you provide a company car, it has to be a Rolls-Royce, but you don't have to provide a company car. Well, why would you then be surprised that companies stop providing company cars? So there were a set of really, bad mistakes made in the way that we constructed public policy. But in a sense, I wish we'd done more, and I wish the government had been more imaginative on its own pay-as-you-go schemes. So what it has done is, broadly speaking, grandfather everybody who was in the civil service before about 2005 into a 60-year-old retirement scheme, right? While applying 65 for people who subsequently joined. They didn't need to do that. I think they could have said to 30-year-olds, look, 60s 30 years ago, we're going to have to shift your retirement age. I think we get too fixated with the idea that once somebody's joined a scheme age 30, even if it's not legally written down, that there's some moral commitment that the pension age is absolutely fixed. And some people think that that's a fair treatment. I think that's actually an unfair treatment of the people who aren't. I think that's a classic overprivilege of insiders, those who are in the system already, compared with outsiders.
But how far are you conscious of, as it were, working within a kind of a political economy that was a sort of liberal welfare state, liberal market economy?
Yep. I think we were working within a political economy because, if we were completely starting anew, I might just, we had a tabula rasa, I might have gone and taken the Swedish model and said, here it is, right? Because the Swedish model basically has 3 tiers. There's an absolute guaranteed keep you out of poverty element. There is an earnings-related pay-as-you-go, but with some really, really interesting features to make that sustainable to the state. I mean, it essentially, is what's called a notional defined contribution scheme, which does not give you age 20 or 30 a fixed retirement age. It tells you that will be determined by the formulas. It has the ability to reduce the pension if GDP growth is so poor that keeping the pensions up would be at an unfair expense of the Swedish taxpayer. And then it has a completely compulsory element on top, but with bulk buying of asset management. And I remember spending a day in Sweden, talking to the Swedish pension minister, and I said, well, how did you end up with such a logical solution? He said, well, we're Swedish, we make Volvos, we make pension systems, and we looked at that and we thought, that might be a logical thing, but we can't just turn up in Britain and say, we're going to have a much bigger pay-as-you-go system, but we're going to change it like this. You do have to a degree, work within what you've got. And so we were trying to take the state pension system and to realise that it had added offsetting bells and whistles which weren't working, the state pension, the SERPs, which had been introduced and then made less and less generous over time, the indexation with prices, etc. And so we pushed it towards a simplification, which at one level, you're quite right, took it back to elements of what it had been, though with some crucial features which had also been added over the years and we gave a bit more oomph to, which was better treatment of the position of women who hadn't been in. Because back in Beveridge, it still was a national insurance system which was to a disadvantage of women who did carer roles, did child caring roles, or who were in and out of the workforce on a part-time basis. And so we gave an oomph to that, and then the Steve Webb reforms took that to a much... But John is quite right. We were, in a sense, building on an existing political economy, and I think you have to accept that. You can't simply turn up and say, well, I mean, here's an interesting thing. The US has, although it has terrible public healthcare provision, it has a more generous state PAYG system than the UK. US Social Security, exists. But US Social Security exists because of a particular political moment in the 1930s and the New Deal that created that. So you can't simply say, why doesn't Britain suddenly become like the US or France or Sweden? I think you have to work with, as it were, intelligent radicalism, which works with the grain of the system that you've got, but is willing to do some pretty radical things to make that system work more effectively.
And if you could do anything now, what reform would you say is still required?
I think the big challenge is the self-employed, and in particular with the proliferation of 0 hours contracts, the self-employed, the gig economy. We always knew that that was a problem. We always knew that our system of auto-enrollment worked best for people that has a contract of employment, but we've gone through an economy where we have more and more people in these sort of semi-detached gig economy things. So I think we really have to return to how do we deal with that? How do we make sure that those people, and that needs more thought. The other thing is, I have always thought that we could have had more, if we had been given a straight mandate on the state pension, I would have thought we could be more imaginative on the state pension age. So the classic challenge on the state pension age is, yes, life expectancy is increasing. In order to make a more generous state pension more affordable, you need a higher state pension age, and that's fair between generations on average. But what do you do about the fact that there's a very big gradient of life expectancy by social class? So it is big. If I was designing things perfectly, what I would probably go for is to have a tier of age where there is a pension provision which is means tested, where you enter at 65 or 66, a tier where you get some sort of in-retirement pension subject to a means testing, but then another date, 2 or 3 years later, where you get it on a completely universal basis. That would enable us to increase the state pension age perhaps even more aggressively without having this sort of, but what are you doing to people who've spent their life in manual labour, etc. Well, for that layer, giving them something which would reflect the fact that they do have to retire from the workforce earlier, with that means tested. But if you only do it for 3 years of the total level of retirement, it's not a major disincentive to savings, because for most of your retirement with your private savings, you're going to get it unfreeze. So I think we've never quite thought flexibly enough about, are there ways around the conundrum that we need to increase the general level of state pension age, but could we be more flexible about how that applies to different groups of people, different social classes or occupational groups with different average life expectancies?